One of the most intriguing yet overlooked crimes is identity theft. The deliberate use of someone else's identity. It is among the fastest growing crimes of the Western world and has ruined countless lives. Identity theft is usually done for minor financial gain, but many cases are much darker, and many cases are much stranger. Most people are in some way vulnerable to it, but it just doesn't receive the coverage or seriousness it deserves. Identity theft is no joke. In this special report, we look at some of history's most shocking cases, and explore how ordinary people can safeguard against one of the modern world's worst crimes. April 23rd, 33 AD, a man emerges from a Middle Eastern burial cave claiming to be Jesus Christ, who was publicly executed just days before. Historians consider this to be humanity's first recorded case of identity theft, but it would not be the last. In the mid-20th century, many women claimed to be Anastasia Romanov, daughter of Russia's last monarch, who was brutally executed decades before along with her entire family. All are thought to have been lying, yet that same era saw a much more successful theft of identity. It all began with the emergence of a little-known boxer called Muhammad Ali. He achieved moderate success and his career spanned decades, but Ali was eventually forced to retire when he was exposed as not being who he claims to be. It turns out Muhammad Ali was really Cassius Clay. While at the beginning of his career, he decided to assume a new identity in order to escape some bizarre criminal charges. 1 year before, he had punched an orangutan during a trip to the zoo. To him, it was just a fun joke to amuse his friends, but when the orangutan pressed charges, the laughter stopped. At the time, orangutan abuse carried a maximum sentence of 1 million years, a length of time Clay might not have even outlived. Facing life and death behind bars, he realized the only realistic way to evade the charges was to assume the identity of someone else. Clay eventually decided on whose identity to assume, a deceased Afghan citizen by the name of Muhammad Ali. As the man was dead, he could not object to the use of his identity, and given the almost non-existent record-keeping standards of Afghanistan at the time, it would be difficult for anyone to dispute his claims. And so Cassius Clay became Muhammad Ali. By the time this was exposed, the orangutan was dead, and her children had no desire to engage in legal battles, so the charges were dropped. In hindsight, we see that Clay set a new trend in identity theft. Countless following cases would involve stealing the identity of deceased people. It's now one of the most common kinds, with the thief simply requesting the birth certificate of a dead person, using it to have other forms of identification made, and living life with that new name. But you don't have to be dead to have your identity stolen. In 2014, a man from South Carolina had his identity stolen by a Nigerian prince. It was a rainy October morning when Joseph Hatfield received an email from the prince in question. He was contacting Joseph out of desperation. As Prince of Nigeria, his father held absolute power. But things were changing. The Arab Spring had triggered an uprising in Nigeria. His father's regime had been thrown into instability and was on the verge of collapse. Everything rested on the actions of a prince, who was calling in a mercenary force to suppress the rebels. But he was short of cash as rebels had cut off access to the national bank, and so he could not afford to call in the mercenaries. That's where Joseph came into it. He could help bring stability to Nigeria and get rich doing it. All he would need to do is give the prince $10,000, and when the king's regime was back in power, Joseph's investment would be paid back 100 times over. Joseph was flattered the prince would choose him to help. Of all the people in the West, of all Americans, he was chosen. After years of losing money on terrible investments, Joseph now had a chance to make it all back. What's more, he was about to invest his life savings in Bitcoin, which seemed much more risky than the honor of a prince. But on being transferred the money, the prince did not use it to save his country, but instead used Joseph's bank details to steal his identity. We may never know why the prince chose to do this, as he has since disappeared after taking out massive debts as Joseph. Perhaps more than any other, this case shows how any one of us is vulnerable to identity theft. Everything about Joseph Hatfield's interaction with the prince seems legitimate and normal. It's the kind of scheme any one of us could have fallen for, not least of all because it was orchestrated by a prince. To make things worse, the value of Bitcoin has skyrocketed since. If Joseph had stuck with his original plan, he would have been a millionaire by New Year's 2017, but instead, he jumped into a canal. Every day, people fall for schemes just like this, and the problem is only getting worse. If the current growth rate of identity theft continues, there may come a time when everyone in the world has their identity stolen, and we will never be certain if we are interacting with who we think we are. In this future civilization, society will be restructured around the fact we do not know the identity of those around us. Perhaps our current conception of identity will be turned upside down, and people will be identified only by a serial number issued at birth. No one would have a first or second name. To ensure citizens abide by the new social order, constant surveillance will be undertaken by the government. Those who refuse to accept the new order will simply disappear. All this could result from identity theft. So how can we stop it? The fate of civilization lies with future generations not yet conceived. One way to prevent the identity theft of your child is to give them a name no one would ever want to steal. So instead of naming your son Lawrence, name him Milfred Milky Hips Watson or Billy Billskeckle. Instead of calling your daughter Elizabeth, call her Frutanga McGrew. It's simple but effective. Another method is to simply not have children, but less preferable as it would cause the human species to die. Perhaps the most effective option would be to establish a strong deterrent against the crime itself. That's the view of China's leading expert in crime prevention, Dr. Gaylord Sinsberth. He argues that nothing less than the death penalty should be given to those guilty of identity theft. In his own words, if a person wishes to assume the identity of a deceased person, we should grant their wish, and their life should be swiftly taken. That's how we handle this kind of thing where I come from. When asked where it is he comes from, he said Chinatown. It's unclear if he meant a Chinatown or a town in China. Nonetheless, his opinions carry weight, and the Chinese government will introduce the death penalty for identity theft in mid-2020. Time will tell if it works, but no other country is considering similar measures, yet the threat of identity theft is universally recognized. In the 1970s, a man in California claimed to be Ronald Reagan. It was Reagan, but for a while no one believed him. At the time, he was the governor of California, with one of America's most powerful governors being initially mistaken for someone else. It wasn't long before the press started asking the obvious question: what's to stop someone from falsely claiming to be Reagan? Once the question had been asked, there was no taking it back. Suddenly, everyone was wondering who the real Reagan was. Was it the man claiming to be him or someone else? What had at first seemed like a joke was now a major roadblock in the progression of Ronald Reagan's career. He was a man of the highest ambition, with his heart fixed on the presidency. But if voters couldn't even decide if he was Ronald Reagan, how could they ever vote for him? Going into the 1980s, it grew into the greatest crisis ever faced by the Republican Party when he was chosen as their candidate for president. It immediately took momentum from their campaign. Those supporting the Democrat candidate could endorse him with relative ease, but those supporting Reagan would always be asked if they were sure he was who they thought he was. Needless to say, this undermined public support for Republicans. Democrats played on the doubt, referring to Reagan as the Republican candidate, rather than by his actual name. Why did they do this? Because Reagan was popular. Polls showed major voting blocs had him as a clear favourite. But if the Democrats could cause enough people to doubt that Reagan was Reagan, maybe they could steal victory. Eventually, Reagan proved his identity by publicly displaying his passport, at which point he won the presidency by a landslide, causing some to wonder why he waited so long to show some proof of identity. The mere suggestion that he might have been an imposter almost derailed his campaign. Such is the threat of identity theft. Identity theft is no joke. It's got to the point where heads of state are barely recognizable, and even the word of strangers claiming to be Nigerian princes can't be trusted. The primary goal of this report is to spread that message. People need to know the dangers of identity theft. Only then will it be taken seriously.